So I started working on my first film with no background whatsoever. I was on a fellowship living in Israel in 1996 to 97. And I started working on a small project there as sort of it was a final project for this fellowship. And when I came back to the US, I needed to raise funds to finish the film, go back and do a proper shoot, etc. And so I don't know how I got the sense that there were grants out there. I was very ensconced in the Jewish world. And the fellowship I was on was a Jewish foundation that sponsored folks to go live there for a year after college. And so I started applying for grants for this film. And I think it was a really different era. It was, this will be a recurring theme throughout this hour. I think it was much simpler, much more straightforward, and actually much easier to get a grant then. And I had writing skills, I guess, from college, and I didn't find it all that challenging to write these initial grant applications. And for better or worse, I was like validated, right? So I was able to raise money through a few different foundations and go back and do a proper shoot and finish the film. And after that, I went to graduate school in journalism, specifically for documentary film, but I was at Berkeley. And there was like a really strong writing component. You couldn't just do the filmmaking. That was sort of the reward of the second year of the program. So again, I did a lot of rigorous writing, and it wasn't necessarily grant writing, but it was writing and training in writing. And so after that graduate school experience, I wound up working with Judith Helfand for many years, off and on, years and years and years. And even like, in the last couple of years, I've worked with her. And she's, I don't know, do folks know Judith Helfand? Yeah, she's made a lot of environmentally focused films, really beautiful, personal documentary storytelling, very funny, very ironic. And I learned a lot from her over the years and really worked as sort of her right-hand person for many, many of the grants that she applied for films like Blue Vinyl and Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, and more recently, Love and Stuff. And, scattered in between, I've worked on my own projects. I've worked for many other filmmakers, a lot of folks in New Day Films, because I joined New Day with my first film way back in the early 2000s or late 90s. So it wound up being kind of my bread and butter while I was working on other projects. And I found that I really enjoy writing about film. I love sort of, this is actually a skill particular to grant writing. And I would say, like, there's, as we know, there's like wide skill sets out there in terms of filmmaking. And so I try not to let my heart sink when friends say to me, Faye, we know that you love filmmaking, but you're really a great writer. So I think that my visual storytelling skills are actually not as strong as my written visual storytelling skills. In other words, I actually really enjoy writing about scenes, writing about characters. And I think that's a good match for folks who are more visual. In other words, someone who's coming to me, they're a director, editor, or they're a shooter, director, and they have really beautiful footage, but they don't know how to write about it. Okay, so I feel like I kind of plug my skills in there. And I also really love kind of coaching people and working with them. It's hard. Grant writing is very hard. And even though we now have a core documentary application, we've had it since 2014, and I'll explain that in a little bit. It's still like a slog, and it's so much work, particularly these larger grant applications. And I enjoy supporting filmmakers and helping them if they need that. Some people don't need it at all. They're cut and dry. They know what they're doing. Other people need emotional support. They need some organizational planning in terms of laying out a timeline for how to move through the steps of the grant and get it done on time. And I actually really enjoy that work too.
Oh, yes, I know the core documentary application, the common one. Is it called the common or core? The common documentary application.
Yeah, they call it the core application.
Okay.
So, you know what, let me put, while you're getting your next question ready, Julie, I'm just going to put a few links in the chat for folks.
Great, thank you. And Also, other folks, if you have some helpful resources, please feel free to use the chat today.
So as Jimmy said, this isn't a how-to, but I do want to give folks a few resources. Let me leave those two in the chat, and Julie, go ahead with your next
Okay,
question.
wonderful. Okay. So what motivated you to become a grant writer in the first place? And for those unfamiliar, can you explain what grant writing entails?
Okay, so the second link that I put, what elements constitute the core application, that's actually the best list around of what these sort of elements are, right? You know what, let me just go to gallery view for a sec. I don't know how many folks are on screen, but maybe you could just do like a thumbs up. How many folks have used the core application on the IDA website to apply for a grant in the last year? Okay, a lot of folks. So you're pretty familiar. You don't need too much background. It was developed in 2014 at the IDA conference, and it was just, I think there was so much pushback from filmmakers feeling like we spend way too much time customizing grants for different foundations, and that was definitely my experience over the years. It was a ton of work. So they created, it's almost like the way in the college application mill, they created some core applications for bunches of schools. So it makes it a lot easier. And it's actually, it's a really good practice, even if you feel, and again, this will probably be a recurring theme, I'm not convinced that grant writing is the best way to raise money anymore, because things have gotten so wildly competitive. I spent years applying to chicken and egg in different dockets. Dockets are like these sort of categories of grants within a foundation. I spent years applying. I knew Judith Helfand personally. I'd worked with her for years, and she was one of the founders of the organization. I never even got past like the first stage. And when I learned the number of applications they were getting, for, let's say they would have 10 spots, they would receive like, first it was, well, we received 500. Then it was, I don't know, the number kept going up exponentially. I still think that it's a very useful tool, and I don't want to say exercise because that makes it sound like you're like an exercise in futility. I think it's a useful tool, and it's a useful strategy to fill out the core application for your project, even if you're not planning to apply to any specific foundations, because learning to articulate your project, learning to answer these questions about what's your story synopsis, who do you imagine your audience is, what is the sort of narrative trajectory, who are your key characters. If you can write about it, then you can articulate it in a really well fleshed out way in other fundraising environments, whether it's you're giving an elevator pitch to some wealthy person who you found yourself in the elevator with at the conference, or you're going to like a proper networking conference like IDFA, or I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the one that happens in New York every fall because they keep changing the name every few years on me, but the Spotlight, it used to be called Spotlight on Documentaries. Those kinds of environments, you need to, let's say you need a lookbook, let's say you need some kind of more flashy materials, you can go to your core application that you worked on and pull those elements out. In other words, it's almost like a foundational recipe. And then you can use all of that written material to draw from as you're creating other elements for pitching your film in other contexts. I'm sure that material will be really useful for doing a crowdfunding campaign, little bits of it. And I think that actually maybe I'm just used to using the core application in its order, but I think obviously starting with a log line is, I think it's a really great practice. Like, can you summarize? And there's a whole art to even writing log lines. I attend the Creative Accountability Group, which meets on Tuesday nights. I've gone several times. It's a really lovely group of people. And someone brought their log line, and we spent half an hour working on it, right? Because that's essentially becomes your elevator pitch in other contexts. Sorry, I think that I may have rambled a little, and Julie, I don't know if I answered your question.
You're not rambling. It's all pure gold. Thank you. How have the dynamics of grant writing changed over the years?
So it's become so much more competitive in terms of numbers. And I think I was surprised, back in like 1999 or 98 when I applied for these grants, and I actually got some of them because I was a first-time filmmaker. I didn't have experience. I think documentary was much less popular then. We've had the advent of the sort of Michael Moore phenomenon, and all the way fast forward all the way to where we are now. And I have to say, I'm kind of a purist when it comes to documentary. I'm sort of old-fashioned. I like cinema verite. I like objective storytelling. I'm not a big fan of the Hollywoodization of documentary, because I feel it's actually anathema to what the art form is. And I think of the art form much more as journalism. And it's not that I'm against artistic elements, but if documentary is facing journalism and taking its cues from there, I think it's a much more productive and frankly useful way to have documentary made than to face Hollywood and take the cues from there, right? And I think that's almost a bind that documentary filmmakers have gotten into. We're expected to have production values of really high-end Hollywood films without funding, without budgetary support. And that's something specific to the United States. In Canada, I think there's a lot more funding out of the gate for filmmakers. But not to digress, but I think that with the changeover in technology, documentary has become much more accessible to people, which is great, like us as filmmakers, but it's also flooded the field with makers. And so if every maker is applying for this grant that you're applying for, you're going to have 800% more competition than I had in the late 90s when nobody cared about documentary and nobody was really, there were a handful of people doing it. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think that there's, I really admire Keith Ochwat, and I took a couple classes with him during lockdown era when he was working with Peter Broderick. And Peter is somebody who I met many, many, many years ago, and I think he's really had his finger on the pulse of independent distribution for documentarians, also in fiction world. But they did these great classes. Was anybody in those classes? I remember seeing some familiar faces. They did two about documentary distribution, and the second one was really interesting, was about hybrid distribution, right? But Keith launched this platform called Show and Tell. And Keith's whole model, which I think is really, really wise, it's about moving away from, it's not necessarily moving away from grant writing, but it's moving away from applying to traditional foundations that fund film along with other things, or I'm sorry, it's moving away from foundations that traditionally fund, they have a really strong film docket, and moving more towards seeking funds from foundations that fund issues, and your film lines up with that issue. And people will say, and there will even be material on the website saying, no film applications, we don't fund films. You can ignore that. You can still try to find a way to, sort of make contacts and make connections and work your way into a place where you could apply, or they would ask you, because they see that their mission and your film line up so directly. And that's one of the biggest pieces of grant making advice. Peter, thank you so much for your suggestion to watch the Tracy Holder talk that she gave on, it's like the Sundance collaborative initiative they have. They are doing little lecture series, and then you can sign up for classes. And Tracy Holder is a really masterful grant writer, and I think I took a class with her many years ago. But she said people think that, so I listened to her talk in November, right? And I took a few notes to share with you guys. She said, people think that a grant writing panel, the people evaluating your application, that they're looking for the best film out there, and they're not. They're looking for the best film that lines up with their mission. Okay, the best film that lines up with their mission. So the number one thing you want to do when you're applying is make sure that your topic is directly supported by their docket, and that changes. They may have different dockets within their foundation, you know, like and that has been like some of my work over the years for Judith, like, look, check out this foundation. What dockets could we fit into? Well, if this one is like square peg in a round hole, not so likely. Oh, look, this one really works. This is the docket you want to apply to. And with Judith, I mean, we applied with films where there were themes in the films that were not so overt, but we could tease them out for the sake of the grant application. Did she get those grants? I think it was less likely. So if you can find a foundation where their issue is like their mission, and the mission changes over the years, and you'll see that. And we'll go into a minute where I might ask you to turn off the recording to discuss how foundations work and how they come up with their missions. But you're going to have much higher likelihood of success. Let me just get to one other thing that Tracy said. So when you're working on your like the main body of your text, I think this was really useful from Tracy. She talked about 3 why questions that you want to be answering. So it's, why are you making the film, right? Do you have unique access? Is it a personal story? Are you connected to the community? So why is it you that should be making it, or your team? And why is it this particular story, right? So why is this issue critical? And that will be easy to answer if, you know, the critical issue in your story lines up with the mission of the foundation. And then why does the film need to be made now? Okay, so why you might know that something critical is happening in your story timeline, but you have to elucidate that. You really have to explain to the foundation why it's critical that you get the funding to finish production or finish editing now before X, Y, or Z happens. Yeah, I just wanted to raise this question that comes up sometimes with early stage filmmakers who are concerned about, and even sometimes like later stage filmmakers, they're concerned about pitching a narrative arc and a storyline that is not yet fleshed out. It's not concluded because they're shooting verite footage and they don't know what will happen. And I just want to reassure people that it's perfectly acceptable and encouraged to write what you think will happen, because what the foundations care about is you winding up with a compelling project that matches their missions, that more or less sticks to what you pitched in your proposal. But if something winds up taking a different turn, they're not going to come back and say, you said this character was going to do that, and instead they did this, and the story ending is different. They don't care about that, right? And so that's where like a small element of sort of, it's not really fictionalizing, but imagining an ending or writing about it in a way that sort of leaves it open to imagination, or, you know, building in suspense even. But I think that foundations actually want to know the ending in advance. So making your best guess and then going forward with that and being confident, but knowing as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, that's kind of like your guesstimate, right? It's totally valid. And I do that all the time for filmmakers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, these questions were developed through a conversation that Faye and Jimmy had back and forth organically. So I'm just reading this as it's written. You mentioned that you feel grant writing isn't as viable for you anymore. Can you elaborate on that? And what shifts or changes in the industry have led you to that perspective?
Mm-hmm. I think the advent of AI, I was getting a little nervous about it. Although the truth is, last year I was working at a nonprofit in their media department, and so I wasn't doing grant writing that whole year. Judith had reached out to me, and I said, I'm really I'm pretty busy this year with this nonprofit. I think I'm kind of like a late adapter of technology. I feel like going backwards it's like actually benefited me more. Like my kids don't have, let's put it this way, like in the car, they ask me for a certain radio station and I say, I love turning the dial, you know? I just think that technology is destroying a lot of things. So I'm not really into using AI. However, my husband is more of an early adopter. He's a graphic designer, and he's been playing around with video editing. And he's finding, like, you know, I said, like, aren't you concerned that all of your design skills are going to be like usurped by somebody just typing in, like, give me a picture of, and I see it out there. Do you guys see it? Do you see these weird photos of, they're not photos, but they're like paintings of people, and there's like an extra finger, and so some of it is like really creepy art. And he said, I'm not so concerned because, you know, like what I do is unique and it has a soul, etc. So I thought, okay, I don't have to worry so much based on what he's saying. People aren't just going to go to Chat GPT and type in, like, fill out my grant application, like, here's my question. And how could it anyhow? How could Chat GPT understand this person's project and know how to write about it from their perspective and, you know, incorporate their unique characters and whatnot? And the answer, I think, is sort of a mixed bag. And I was I'm trying to think what meeting I was in. Oh, it was so I've been active in New Day Films since late 90s. Do folks know New Day Films? It's a cooperative of independent, mostly social issue media makers. There's a few fiction filmmakers in there too, but it's a collective of folks who decided to take distribution back into our own hands, self-distribute films, mostly in the educational market. And it's been like it's had its ups and downs, but it's like persisted, and it's now a very healthy co-op. There's over 100 filmmakers. It, you know, cycles through. People come in, they distribute their films. Eventually they go sort of classics. They kind of retire, become less active, but it's filmmakers all over the country. And we try to keep up on current topics, like production wise and in other areas. So we had a session about AI, and a filmmaker who I've known for many years, who she works in Texas. And this was like sort of this was a difficult thing to hear her say. I don't think it was like the death knell of grant writing, but she said, you know, I work alone, and our office mates have become virtual, and I don't have people around me to bounce ideas off of. And so when I'm writing a grant, I find it super useful to just like write, you know, have a conversation with Chat GPT. And my heart just sank, you know, because if that's where things are headed, you know, and I know like there's huge questions about AI in, you know, use in high school and colleges and grad programs even. There was a lawyer who I think lost his job for using AI to write a brief, which I think was like not a good use of judgment. But I feel like it could take over the grant writing industry to a certain extent, or, you know, my work would be reviewing and editing what a filmmaker derived from Chat GPT, which I guess isn't the worst thing in the world. But Chat GPT has its own like extreme bias in terms of what content it's fed. So we're coming back to the mainstream narrative again. Like if you're working on some edgy project about, you know, people who are organizing against such and such mainstream government, you know, issue, ChatGPT is not going to be able to generate anything useful for you, or it's just going to generate something really slanted. Or other folks have said like, wow, I asked a question of ChatGPT and it came back with this like super white male gaze, you know, and I like that language doesn't really like reflect my project at all. So there are weaknesses, but I think also it's free. I'm sure there are paid versions, and they're cheaper than, you know, hiring a human to do that kind of work for you. So that's why I sort of wonder a little bit about the future of the field.
Wow. Apart from traditional grants, are there other funding avenues you'd recommend for filmmakers to, oh, excuse me, let me back up. What advice would you give documentary filmmakers?
Yeah, I think diversifying your fundraising approach, which I'm sure everybody in this in this room is already doing, right? So you can use let's say you take like a 3 or 6 month cycle and you focus on grant writing. I connected with an old friend and colleague who I made a film with many years ago, and she said, you know, Faye, I was in the grant writing cycle for a full year and we didn't get anything, and I had to step back. And I think if you can set a time limit on it, that's maybe a good way to approach it, because it's easy to, and I know I've totally fallen into this myself, it's easy to write application, it's easy to write your core application and keep submitting, and you tweak it for this application and that application, but it's easy to get on that hamster wheel and get a little trapped, and you're sort of tricked into feeling like I'm moving forward. And you are, if you can maybe get a little feedback from a foundation as to why you were rejected. It's harder to get that feedback these days because they have such high volume of filmmakers who apply. But if you can keep tweaking and improving your project and your application, then you're in the useful zone. But if you are, and I know this because I've done it, if you are submitting for the sake of feeling like you're moving forward on your project, but all you're doing is kind of resubmitting something similar to, you know, what you submitted most recently that was rejected, you can get caught in kind of a mind game where you're not really moving your project forward. So I would say, like, put some time parameters on your grant writing cycle. And I know it's a lot to do at once, but if you can start to think about other avenues like raising from individuals, raising through crowdfunding, raising via Keith Ochoat's model of going to organizations that support your topic, then the rejections from the foundations, I think, will be a little more cushioned. And I would say now, like, it's really, really different than it was even 10 years ago. I would say to go in with a very pragmatic mindset that it's pretty hard to get the high-end grants these days simply because of numbers, right? So you're not counting on something. You're, maybe think of it more like playing the lottery, right? Playing the lottery, but a lottery in which you actually really benefit from the process of buying the ticket, as opposed to just, I don't know, I've never bought a lottery ticket. I think you just go and like pay someone at the counter, right? Here, like, you actually, at least for the first round, you're really pushing your project forward by asking yourself these tough but super important questions about your project and how to frame it, and really digging deep into your connection to it. You know, there's nothing harder to me than writing out, even after all these years, like really writing out what will the film look like. And I have a project I've been working on, like, in really small chunks for many years. And I'm calling it 18 short films about my brother. It's a series of short films, but all in one longer film about my brother who died 10 years ago. And people keep saying to me, like, it's really compelling, but what is it going to look like? What is it going to look like? And that's the hardest thing for me. Not on other people's projects. There, it's much easier for me to do. But on this one, it's a little experimental. And, like, I really have to force myself to sit down and write out the scenes. What do I see? And I think that's an amazingly useful exercise that comes out of grant writing.
Thank you. So we have about 3 questions and about 20 minutes to go. We always like to end on time. So I'll ask these and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So when it comes to our Q&A, Faye, what type of questions do you think you would, how can we get the most bang for our buck if we ask you some questions today? What do you love most to talk about?
I don't know. Surprise me.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if I can,
all right. We'll surprise her. All right. It's like playing the lottery, but we benefit from it. So everyone.
If I can't answer it, I'll say, let's ask Tracy Holder and she'll get back to us.
Sounds good. Okay.
So just in terms of with the questions, there are definitely more questions than we have time for. So you don't need to get through all the fireside questions.
She indicated Yeah, she indicated the ones she wanted me to focus on today. Apart from traditional grants, are there other funding avenues you'd recommend for filmmakers to explore?
I'm sorry, I was watching poor
Oh,
Jimmy
that's okay.
sneeze. Apart from traditional,
Yeah, you were talking about this a little bit with Keith. But apart from traditional grants, are there
Mhm.
other funding avenues you'd recommend for filmmakers to explore?
Yes, and I realized that I didn't, there's one other link that I want to put in the chat. Okay, I'll do it after I answer this, but it's a link to, it's on the IDA's website, which is a really useful website for grant writing. And that's sort of like, it's a really nice Excel chart of all these different film foundations and dockets and fellowships even. So I'll put that in the link so you can see the traditional ones. Yeah, but the non-traditional ones, I don't know that I think the non-traditional ones are actually specific to your topic. So it involves researching, for example, I would probably look for my film about my brother, I would probably look for organizations that work on issues of sibling loss, grief, topics like that. And again, this is where like working through the full application is helpful, because when you get to the sections on audience and potential partner organizations, by researching your potential partners, you also may be researching your potential funders down the road, and not even just for distribution. If you can get your film to a certain place, maybe they'll kick in the final money you need for the edit, or maybe even sooner, right? Yeah, and again, I would check out Keith Ochoat's, not just like his website, Show and Tell. Back when I guess it was like 2 years ago when I was taking his class, he was just kind of morphing it was like a 6-week class that he had taught with Peter Broderick. He was launching Show and Tell as a video platform for streaming for online events, but I think he's really expanded it, and now it's can help you with crowdfunding. And I'm trying to think if I took so many of like these sort of freebie classes he offered, but I think he also has a subscription model. He gets really granular with how, even like down to like, what should the subject heading be for an email to an organization that you're approaching as a partner, like really, really granular. And I find that material very useful, because a lot of it feels like, it's common sense, right? But this guy has studied it. He's like crunched the data, and, including details like which middle manager should you be trying to approach in an organization? Like, should you go to the top? No, he found that like the vice president of such and such is like, that's like, sort of the sweet spot that he found of approaching people in organizations. So I would definitely check out his website. The other organizations in the landscape who focus on crowdfunding, I think that they're super useful too. The session that this little community did, I'm forgetting the woman who presented. She's like the performance artist filmmaker. I found that to be a really useful session, and they pointed people toward great resources on crowdfunding that I have to explore myself.
Where did
CDs and things like that.
Where was that? Where did you find that?
That was a session that was presented right in this personal documentary filmmaking group.
I'll get the link from YouTube.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. So we will open up to Q&A after this last question. Given your current perspective, how do you see the future of grant writing evolving?
I'm sorry, the future of grant writing in general?
Evolving, yeah, like the future of grant writing.
Yeah. I feel like there's kind of a split in a way within like the world of grant making for films, or grant writing for films. I think that you have folks who have really strong craft skills, and they're able to put together an application that allows them to go after like the major pots of money. And I think that will continue. I think that'll go on forever, right? And then you have, folks who, I would put myself in this category, can put together one element, like So for your application, you have your written piece and you have your work sample. And I always fall down on the work sample. It's something I struggle with. You know, I don't edit well yet. I think that's a different category of folks where like the topic could be really compelling, but there are challenges to making an application that's polished, that's so polished that they could get the Sundance money or the Creative Capital money or the Rockefeller or Ford Foundation money. And I would put ITVS in that category, although I think ITVS is more welcoming and more open to like one-man band filmmakers for sure than some of those other places. And so I think there's like almost like a bifurcation in the field, and I'm not happy about it, but I don't think there's anything to be done because this is how the grant world has developed, and this is how the documentary world has developed, for better or worse. So I think for those of us who are a little more scrappy, and well, I guess I'll just say as a caveat, like there are films, this was like a much older film, but Melissa Regan, who's in New Day with me, and she's been like getting people together to discuss AI. She made a film called No Dumb Questions many years ago. And it was a really interesting, funny, compelling film about, I think, a member of her family who was transitioning, and the kids had all these questions. It was like an uncle who was becoming an aunt or something, and the kids had these funny questions about it. And she just filmed it, and the production values were like super low. But the topic was hilarious, and the characters were wonderful. And so that film took off, and I believe she got funding for it. Maybe it just took off on its own. I don't remember, but I think there is like that sliver of films. Again, that was like a hot topic at the time. It was probably one of the first films on transgender issues. There are a couple films that, even though they have, you know, less access or lower, you know, production values, et cetera, the topic is either so compelling or so on point in terms of what foundations are looking for that it will move from category B over to category A and have a chance of getting this major funding. And then I guess the other piece is like, it's sort of an open question, like what role will AI play? And I think I don't want to paint too grim a picture of it, because it may be a useful tool. I think because writing has been like a skill of mine for 20 years, I'm really resistant to like giving away any of that autonomy to like a machine that's been trained on like mainstream media that I totally refuse to read because it's all lies. However, I'm well aware of a rising sort of like hypocrisy in myself since attending one of these New Day discussions about AI, and my husband playing around with AI and editing. In the editing world, where I feel like I'm all thumbs and I don't know what I'm doing, I'm kind of opening my mind up to like what AI could offer. And also, again, because of the session that lovely editor did here in the personal documentary group, and she was like saying like, here are some tools you can play around with. So for someone who's like not skilled in an arena like I am in editing, I feel like, oh, maybe it could be useful. So I don't want to totally shut it down in the grant writing world. Like if it can get you to a certain place and save you some money, and then you're either doing the review and really massaging the text to make it useful, or you're bringing it to somebody like me to do that, could be useful.
Thank you. We're going to bring Paul up with his question.
Yeah, thank you. Great session, Faye. Really wonderful to hear your observations. And I as a longtime documentary filmmaker and grant writer, I agree with many of your observations. One of the things I'm wondering about, I also have gotten very cynical about any kind of traditional funding from the major documentary funderies. One thing I have been exploring or trying to explore with limited success, but some success, is donor advised funds with private foundations. I wonder if